Well, as we lead up to the coronation, calls for reparation, or indeed the euphemistic restorative justice, have intensified. Questions surrounding the Koh-i-Noor diamond or on Queen Mary's crown have prompted the family not to use it in the ceremony. And research submitted by The Guardian last week, which famously has slave-linking trade, were met with support from the palace for more exploration into the monarchy's link to the slave trade. But as my next guest points out, Britain was not exceptional in its engagement in slavery, colonialism or conquest. It was exceptional in its actions to bring such injustices to an end. In Britain, we should be proud of our history, not ashamed of it. So who better to have with me than the illustrious history professor Robert Toombs, famous for his book, The History of England, The English History. Professor, thank you so much for joining me. You had a brilliant piece in The Telegraph today setting this out. We were the one country that decided to abolish slavery, and everyone else throughout history had been involved in the slave trade before that.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, absolutely right. The British Empire, with all its faults, and of course we're always told how many faults it had, its great achievement, one could say, was abolishing global slavery. Until modern times, when there's been some return of slavery, unfortunately. But in the 19th century, it was the British Empire that set itself the task of stopping what it saw as what people in Britain saw as the abomination of the slave trade, and then of trying to stop slavery in Africa particularly, and also in Asia. So the Royal Navy was patrolling to stop slave ships all through the 19th century, and indeed well into the 1970s. It was stopping slave ships into the Persian Gulf.
And do you think that is enough, that compensates for the profits we made from the slave trade? Because obviously being involved in the slave trade at an earlier point was enormously profitable for both individuals and institutions.
Well, it's very difficult to say what is adequate compensation. Some historians have calculated that the costs of abolition were greater than the profits from slavery, but then I think we wouldn't want to just see it in monetary terms. Our forebears, including William Pitt the Younger, spoke very eloquently about the wickedness of the slave trade and of our participation in it. People saw this as being a terrible crime for which we should be ashamed, and saw the abolition of slavery, insofar as we could bring it about, as indeed the reparation that we would pay for having been involved in the trade earlier. And of course, you know, the costs of
Pitt the Younger has a slightly mixed record, doesn't he? Because although he says that, actually the slave trade isn't abolished until after he's died. He doesn't actually manage to deliver on it, even though he thought it was wrong.
It's a very interesting moral dilemma, which he and people like Wilberforce were very well aware of. We were in the middle of a world war. The trade with the West Indies and Africa was very important. It was very important for the Navy. And so you had the problem of saying, do we abolish slavery now, which might mean we would lose a world war against the French revolutionaries, or do we have to postpone it until time is more suitable, time is more favourable? I mean, it was still abolished during the Napoleonic Wars, the slave trade, as you know, in 1807. And so a great risk was taken. A very profitable trade was given up. Because although some people have argued that slavery was no longer as profitable as once it was, I think modern research shows it was in fact increasingly profitable, and giving it up was a great economic sacrifice. But yes, I mean, you could say,
what about the compensation that was paid?
Yes.
When slavery was abolished across the British Empire, compensation was paid to the imperial slave owners. Do you think their descendants have any moral responsibility, that they have got, in a sense, blood money for slavery, and that they owe any duty of reparation?
Well, a well-known journalist, a television journalist, recently offered to pay some reparation to charities in the West Indies, if I remember rightly. And I wrote a slightly jocular letter to the Times saying that as her family had received something like the equivalent of £20 million from the taxpayer, perhaps some donation to the National Health Service might also be thought appropriate. these people did get a lot of money in compensation, and it was at the time very controversial. It was the taxpayer who paid to ransom slaves because it was thought that not to do so would delay the abolition of slavery in the empire. And so it was a considerable sacrifice by the taxpayer. Of course, people have said, well, it shouldn't have been done. It should have been the slaves who received the compensation, not the slave owners. But politically speaking, that was not really possible. And I often think of the contrast with Russia. When the Russian serfs were finally emancipated in the 1860s, they were forced to pay compensation. In the British case, it was the taxpayer who paid the compensation.
And do you think dragging the monarchy into this just before the coronation is an opportunistic political move by the people who are making this such an issue, or was it just inevitable that this would come up at some point in relation to the king?
I think probably both. I think that it's come up now is clearly opportunistic. At the moment, the institution of the monarchy is quite vulnerable because people will be threatening to, in some way, disrupt the coronation or try to spoil the coronation, which I think very few of us would want to happen. Only a few Republicans would want that to happen. It's going to be a great national occasion. So I think that something has got